Hello everybody, and welcome to another Ikoria draft guide video. Today we're going to be talking about the top 3 commons for each color and overall. But before I dive in, I do want to remind you that if you enjoy the video, be sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment in the comment section down below with any questions or feedback. It really does help me out a ton, and I love interacting with all of you folks in the comment section. Without further ado, let's get to the guide, starting with the white cards. First up, we have Pacifism as the number 1 white common. This is just a premium removal spell, and even though there is probably going to be more artifact and enchantment removal running around the format because of Wilt existing as a cycling answer to cards like Pacifism, I still think it is going to be a great card and a premium removal spell that you will take highly in white. Next up, at the number 2 slot, we have Snare Tactician. This is a very efficient card, not only offensively, but also defensively, because you can tap opponent's creatures when you are on their turn as well, because cycling can be done at instant speed. So if you're an aggressive deck, you can play your Snare Tactician, tap down their blocker, and attack them. And if you are on defense, you can have your Snare Tactician up, cycle a card on their turn, and prevent them from attacking you with their best creature. Snare Tactician plays both sides of the ball, metaphorically speaking, and is overall going to be a great card. And just imagine having 2 of these in play, and then your opponent basically can never block. So I'm really looking forward to playing with Snare Tactician in all of my white decks. At number 3, we have Divine Arrow. This card is going to answer most of the threats you care about. 4 toughness does seem to be relatively prevalent in the set, and Divine Arrow luckily hits that 4 toughness mark. Another benefit with Divine Arrow is that because cycling is in the set, if you hold this up on defense and your opponent doesn't attack you in an attempt to play around Divine Arrow, then you can just use some of your cycling cards instead and continue using your mana. That also means that your opponent is less likely to suspect Divine Arrow, because if you're holding up mana, it is relatively likely that you will just be cycling your card. So Divine Arrow gets the nod as the number 3 white common. Moving on to the blue cards, I have in the number 1 slot Essence Scatter. This card is just very efficient interaction, especially because a lot of the cards in this format are relatively expensive or relatively scary to come down with Mutate a turn early, so you want to be able to make sure you don't fall too far behind in the early stages of the game. You don't want your opponent going 2-drop into 3-drop into mutating a creature without you being able to do anything, especially because some of the mutate creatures only cost 3, so you want to be able to, on the draw, have an answer to their turn 3 mutate play, or at the very least have some interaction for their late game bomb. I think Essence Scatter is going to be very good. It also works well in the blue-red spells archetype. It puts a spell into your graveyard for some of the payoffs that care about that, and is overall just going to be a very efficient answer to some of the very powerful creatures running around in this format. At number 2 is Dreamtail Heron. This is a very potent card as well, not only as a 5-mana 3/4 flyer, which you can just play it as, but also because if you mutate it onto a creature, you get your card back immediately, so you are not punished as much for mutating. One thing I will note is that if you use Dreamtail Heron to mutate onto something, a lot of the time, you're basically turning your Dreamtail Heron into a can-tripping aura. So sometimes you're going to want to just go wider and just wait that, instead of just putting all your eggs in one basket, so to speak, you'll just want to play your Dreamtail Heron as a 3/4 flyer on its own. I do think the card is going to be great, and it works really well if you combine it with some of the more powerful mutate cards that are at uncommon as well, because then you not only are drawing your card, you're getting your other mutate triggers as well. So I think Dreamtail Heron is going to be fantastic, and some of the blue cards, like the River Otter that has Scroll Thief text that draws you an extra card when it does damage, I think that card is also going to be a nice combo with Dreamtail Heron, which also makes the card a little bit better as well, because you got to keep it in context with the other commons around it. Things like Gust of Wind, which also works well with Dreamtail Heron because it works better if you have creatures with flying. I think this is going to be a pretty solid card, just as a good blue tempo play. This type of card in the past has sometimes been an instant speed effect, but it doesn't have the option of costing only 2 mana, and I think there is going to be a decent amount of flying in blue, and especially in blue-white decks. So Gust of Wind is going to cost 2 mana a decent amount of the time in a lot of your decks, and when it does cost 2 mana, it is absolutely fantastic, and even when it doesn't cost 2 mana, when it costs 4 mana, it's still a great tempo play and can really punish your opponent for putting all their eggs into one basket in terms of tempo, because they will get both parts of the mutated creature back into their hand, but they have to spend all of that mana again, which is really nice for you if you're trying to beat down with a tempo deck, or just try to stall until you draw your own mutate cards, and it does replace itself, which is quite nice. A lot of the time, a bounce spell would be at its best on like if it was an instant or if it could target your own things, but because this does cantrip, I'm willing to look aside for some of those issues, because I think the card is going to be quite powerful, bouncing your opponent's creatures and letting you enable some attacks or just stall the game out a little bit. Moving on to the black cards, at the number 1 spot is Blood Curdle. This card is fantastic. It kills anything at instant speed and gives menace to one of your creatures to boot. Menace is even relevant for some of the other cards in the set that care about things with menace, so it's an additional piece of relevance, and I think that this card is going to be fantastic. It being an instant, again, works well with cycling, works well with counterspells in blue, and overall, I am very excited to play with Blood Curdle. And it's also a great early pick because you can splash it in a lot of decks. If you're playing like a green-blue deck, it's pretty easy to splash a Blood Curdle off of some of the splash effects available to green decks, or even if you just get a couple of gain lands that can make black mana, and maybe one of the uncommon mana rocks, things like that make you able to splash Blood Curdle more frequently than you would be otherwise, and that is another great benefit working in its favor. Next up at the number 2 slot is Dead Weight, and while it will not kill bigger creatures or creatures that have been mutated onto, it is great at picking off those creatures that your opponents might want to mutate onto. So if they play a 2-drop that's a 2/2 that you think your opponent might want to mutate onto, you can deadweight that card before your opponent gets the chance. It's also just fine shrinking big mutate creatures because a 5/4 is much less threatening as a 3/2 creature. Things like that make deadweight the number 2 black common just great cheap interaction for control decks or aggressive decks alike. Number 3 black common is Boot Nipper. This card is fantastic, especially if you mutate onto it. The fact that you can choose Death Touch or Lifelink is quite nice. Most of the time you're going to want to choose Death Touch with this card because then it will trade for anything, and also it becomes a great card to mutate onto. But in some situations I could see putting Lifelink onto it if you have a card that you want to mutate onto it that you really just want to get a big swing of life. So if you're stabilizing the game in the middle stages and you're like, okay, I'm going to need some life gain, you can put your Boot Nipper in with Lifelink and then mutate something bigger onto it and gain a bunch of life in one fell swoop. I think Boot Nipper is going to be a great card, and its flexibility means that it is going to take the spot of number 3 black common. Moving on to red, we have number 1 Fire Prophecy. This card is fantastic. 2 mana, deal 3 to a creature is relatively standard, but the fact that you get to put a card from your hand on the bottom and then draw a card is really nice because it helps you smooth out your draws, avoid flood, and or help you find lands in the early stages of the game, which makes Fire Prophecy a fantastic card and one that I'm really looking forward to playing. It also works well in the blue-red spells archetype in particular, though you'll play this in every single red deck. It's not like, oh, I have to be blue-red spells to play it. It's just going to be a little bit of added upside when there is some spell payoffs in the format. Number 2 is Rumbling Rock Slide. This is going to be 4 mana, deal 4+. I say 4+ because at the very minimum, you're going to be casting this and dealing 4 damage, unless you have some like weird mana ramp from, I guess, one of the mana rocks at uncommon. But basically, this is going to be a 4 mana, deal 4 or more, which means that it's going to kill basically everything you care about, because on turn 4, your opponent's probably not going to have a 5 toughness creature, and on turn 5, if your opponent has a 5 mana 5/5, you'll probably have a 5th land, so it scales well into the game, and it's going to be able to kill most of the things you care about, and for that reason, it is also going to be a premium removal spell, and one that you can also splash, similar to the Blood Curdle in black. It's only 1 pip, and it kills most things in the late game, so this is going to be a card that you splash if you can in your limited decks that are going to the late game and want removal, and also, I could see this being a great splash card for sealed decks in particular, because those decks tend to want to splash a lot of removal spells, and Rumbling Rock Slide is the type of removal spell that is good to splash because it's not unconditional, but it's relatively unconditional and pretty easy to get a hold of. Next up, because it is a common, next up is Prickly Marmoset. This card is absolutely terrifying to play against. It's a 3 mana 2/3 first strike, but it can get +2/+0 at any time when you cycle a card, and your opponent has to be very afraid of this effect. It's actually the threat of activation that is very scary. If you attack this card into your opponent's 4/4, they basically can't block because it's so easy for you to have a cycling card because cycling is so prevalent in the set. And it is so bad for them if you do have that cycling card. Another scary thing about the Marmoset is that if you have a couple of cycling cards in your hand, sometimes you can attack them for like 6 damage out of nowhere by just cycling 2 cards when they don't expect it. It's also a pretty good blocker because your opponent, again, has to be relatively fearful if you're holding up mana on their turn. If you do have the Prickly Marmoset in play and you don't have to cycle a card, maybe consider holding it so that you can get that extra value, or so that your opponent really can't block. Because if you have a Prickly Marmoset in play and then you have only one card in hand that you just drew, your opponent's less likely to be afraid of it. But that being said, I still think this card is great and is definitely worthy of a top 3 spot in the red commons. Moving on to the green cards, we have some very powerful stuff here, starting off with Ram Through, which is just a very premium removal spell. It is not a fight spell, it is a punch spell or a bite effect, similar to Rabbit Bite. Your creature just does damage equal to its power to a creature you don't control, which is quite nice. And then there's added benefit of the creature being able to deal excess damage to that creature's controller, which works really well. It does that extra damage if your creature has trample, and a lot of the creatures with trample are relatively big, or you can give creatures that are relatively big trample. So those are the creatures you want to have trample, and then if you use Ram Through with those big creatures, which you want to do because those are the ones with the highest power to punch with, you'll use your Ram Through, and you can maybe even sometimes burn your opponent out. If they, say, have a 4/4 and you have a 6/6 trample, you can punch that creature, do 2 extra damage to them, and then attack them for 6, and maybe get through an extra 6 damage that way as well. So really potent card. Another good use for Ram Through that is worth noting is that if you attack your opponent, say with that 6/6 trample, and they go for like a double block, say with a 4/4 and a 3/3, which would normally be a good double block, you can use Ram Through on the 4/4, and then mid-combat, your creature will not only kill and win the double block exchange, you'll do that 2 extra damage from Ram Throughing their 4/4 with your 6/6, but you'll also trample over for an extra 3 damage, so you'll essentially get through 5 damage, which is really nice, and makes Ram Through not only a very scary removal spell, but also a very scary combat trick. Moving on to the number 2 green common, I have it as Essence Symbiote. This is a potent card in those mutate decks. It reminds me almost of Wild Growth Walker in the way that it buffs up those mutated creatures. It is a good target to mutate onto, but also just good if you're mutating onto other creatures and have Essence Symbiote in play, because you're going to be mutating those creatures, getting them bigger, gaining some life to help you stabilize. It doesn't provide you a card when you mutate, like a card's worth of value or anything, but it is still definitely very effective, and it's out of its baseline, a 2-mana 2/2, which doesn't need all that much to be great, and this bonus text definitely does make the Essence Symbiote great. Moving on to the number 3 green common, and this one really is a fantastic one. The only reason it's not number 2 is because some decks don't really care about the lands as much, and but is Migratory Greathorn. And Migratory Greathorn is going to be fantastic. It does get you a card's worth of value immediately when you mutate. It gets you that basic land, which is going to be really nice. And overall, I'm really excited to be playing with this card. It helps enable your splashes. It helps enable your other mutate cards. And it only costs 3 mana to mutate, so you can be attacking in with a 3 mana 3/4 as early as turn 3. Going turn 2 Essence Symbiote into turn 3 Migratory Greathorn is going to be very scary. Or just any 2-drop into Greathorn, because then the following turn you can play a 5-drop, you can mutate something else onto it and get another land. It's going to be very potent and very good for fixing your mana. And I think that if you have a couple of Migratory Greathorns, you're more able to splash things like the Blood Curdles of the set that you'll want to splash. And so Migratory Greathorn also unlocks other options available to you in your decks. So I think Migratory Greathorn is definitely a good card and worth an early pick. For the final section here, we're going to be talking about the overall top 3 commons. At the number 1 spot, I have Fire Prophecy. This card is just very, very efficient, and the filtering that it gives you is not to be undervalued. I think that I've talked with some folks about the math of the set, and it does kill a large percentage of the creatures in the set. It kills like 2/3 of them or something like that, maybe even more. And another thing to note is that it is only 2 mana, so like you don't have to be like, oh, my premium removal spell that I first picked doesn't kill everything. I mean, it does only cost 2 mana, so you can't be too sad with it, and the rummaging effect is incredibly relevant. So I think Fire Prophecy, for those reasons, is going to be a premium card in the set, and one that you really want to have access to as many copies as you can. It's going to be good in aggressive decks, good in controlling decks, and really is going to enable a lot of sweet shenanigans. Number 2 is Blood Curdle. This card was almost number 1, but I think Fire Prophecy just barely edges it out, and Blood Curdle is going to be fantastic as well. It's a unconditional removal spell, as I already said, and is definitely going to earn that number 2 spot. And number 3 is Ram Through. Again, all those benefits I talked about before really makes this justified as the number 3 slot. It's not as good as Blood Curdle or Fire Prophecy because it won't always do stuff. So, for example, if you don't have a creature in play, Ram Through doesn't really do much, whereas Fire Prophecy will always do 3, Blood Curdle will always kill a creature. But I definitely do still enjoy Ram Through as a card, and I think that it's going to be a fantastic addition to any of your green decks. That is going to do it for the top 3 commons. The top 3 commons in every color and the top 3 overall. I do hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think the top 3 commons are in the comment section down below, and I will talk to you in my next video. Remember to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future videos, and I'll talk to you next time.